So, when I was 22 years old, I would ride the bus to work every morning. I worked at this fancy restaurant in downtown Portland. When I would ride the bus to work every morning, a couple stops later, this woman, Jessica, she would get on. You know, Jessica was well put together, really attractive, way out of my league. She worked some corporate job, but we kind of became bus buddies. You know, we do a little light flirting, but, you know, she was way out of my league. So this restaurant that I worked at, it was in downtown, it was in this building, and upstairs in the building was this newspaper. This was like 20 years ago. And there was this hip local newspaper inside Portland. And back then I used to smoke cigarettes, and lots of the writers, they smoked cigarettes. So I'd meet with them out on the curb, you know, and we'd smoke cigarettes together. And one day I asked them, like, hey, I was like, what would it take to contribute an article, you know, to the newspaper? They're like, well, just write something about a unique perspective about Portland. I was like, all right, I can do that. So I went home that night and I typed up this story. Next day, you know, I rode the bus, you know, got on. Jessica got on a couple stops later. We did our light flirting, you know, went off and, you know, went to work. So I hand my story to one of the writers on a smoke break. And they're like, all right. So like 2 days later, I'm outside on a smoke break. And one of the writers like, editor wants to see you. I'm like, oh shit. So I go upstairs and I go up into the editor's office and he's like, I love the story. He's like, how much do you want for it? Now understand, like I'd never been published before, never been published since. And I'm sitting there like awestruck. And I say, $300. He's like, sold. I'm like, damn it, should have asked for $500. I didn't know how it worked. So a couple weeks later, next edition of the newspaper, it comes out. And I grab a copy of it and I open it up and there's my story in the center of the newspaper, like the featured article. They even had artwork to go along with it. I was like, all right. I was ecstatic. And then they asked me to read at some literary event. I was supposed to read the story at one of those like hip Portland coffee shops that kind of has a stage, you know. They also serve alcohol at night, one of those kind of places. And of course I said yes. So the next day I'm riding the bus downtown Portland going to work. Jessica gets on and I'm thinking, you know, I need a date to this event. So I was like, well, I'm going to ask her out. I was like, hey, Jessica. I was like, you know, I just got published. I'm supposed to read at this event. Would you like to come with me? Would you like to be my date? She's like, yeah. I was like, all right. I was feeling good, man. I was feeling good. So the night of the event, I meet up with Jessica at some restaurant that's kind of close to the event. We go in, you know, we have cocktails and have some appetizers, you know, and things are going well. We're doing some light flirting. At one point, she even reaches over and touches my hand. I mean, good Lord, things were going great. But there was this voice in my head saying, I wonder what she's going to think about the story. I wonder what she's going to think about it. But another voice was like, oh, it's going to be fine. Editor liked it. The writers liked it. It's going to be great. So we go into the event. This place seats like 80 to 100 people, kind of an event like this. So the whole show starts. A couple poets go on. They read. Then this guy, he'd published this novel, so he goes up and he reads an excerpt from his novel. And then it's my turn. So I bring the newspaper with me. I thought it was like a good little shtick, you know. Stand there, I'm just reading the paper. So I go up and I, you know, bring the paper up onto the stage and I open it up and I start reading the story. So the story is titled Over and Over. And my unique perspective about Portland was a day in the life of doing community service hours. So you know those big white vans that you see around town hauling 15 to 18 people picking up trash in parks around town or alongside the roadsides? It was a day in the life of doing community service hours. Now, obviously, to get community service hours, you have to commit a crime. So I explained that I had gotten busted growing weed. This was back when weed was illegal, and that's why I was doing community service hours. And when you do community service hours, you meet over and over with the same people, and you make friends, you make acquaintances. So I'd made friends with this older man, William. William was like in his mid-60s, really cool guy. He looked just like Charles Bukowski on the cover of Tales of Ordinary Madness. If you don't know the reference, you can look it up after the show, but exactly like that. And I would even hang out with William outside of doing community service hours. And William was really into opera. I'd go over to his place. He's always playing me opera records. I didn't really understand opera, but the guy loved it. So one day, William and I, we meet up doing community service hours, and we get on the same van, and we sit down, and we're shooting the shit. And we're sitting next to each other, and then this guy gets on the van. And William nudges me, and he's like, oh, God, this guy. He's like, just wait. He's going to start talking about his dead kids. And as if on cue, the guy sits down a couple seats behind us, and he starts telling the guy next to him, starts telling the story about how he'd been in this tragic accident and how his kids had died. William's like, told you. So we drive out to Alberta Park, and we spend the day picking up trash and drug paraphernalia, lots of heroin needles. Heroin needles go into one bag, trash goes into another. So William and I were walking around the park, talking, having a conversation, and this guy, he's going around to everyone on work crew. He keeps telling the same story over and over about how he'd been in this accident and how his kids had died. William's like, I told you. And William explained that when he first met the guy, the guy had told the story to William and he'd felt terrible for him. But then he explained the guy would just keep showing up to do community service hours, and he just kept telling the story over and over. And William's like, man, he's like, after a while, it's just too much. And then details of the story, it changed. And William's like, I don't even think this guy even had kids. So William and I, we're talking, and we're having this great conversation about loss and grief and, proper ways to deal with it. So we finish up our day, cleaning up trash, and, we get back onto the van, and we get into the van, and we sit down, and sure enough, there's an extra seat, sitting right here across the aisle from me, and who sits down across from me? That guy. And he looks over, when we sit down, and he realizes he hasn't told me the story yet. And he's looking at me, and he's like, hey, gets my attention. I'm like, hey. And then he starts telling me the story. So I'm reading the story out of the newspaper, and the last line of my story in the paper is, I already hated him and his dead kids. So I fold up the newspaper, and people in the audience, they're clapping, they're laughing, and I look out in the audience, and I see Jessica kind of collecting her things, and she's headed toward the exit. So I go over, and I meet her at the exit, and I was like, hey, what'd you think? You want to go catch a drink somewhere? She just looks me in the eye, and she says, please, don't ever speak to me again. So word of advice, if you're ever on a first date and you find yourself at some literary event, and you find yourself reading a story about doing community service hours, don't end your story with the line, I already hated him and his dead kids. Chances of a second date, right off the cliff. Thank you. John will be up next.